Good afternoon. Let me start by wishing you all a healthy, prosperous, and successful 2022. Perhaps in the past, these wishes for good health did not have the same connotation as they have today, being almost 2 years in a pandemic. COVID-19 showed us once again how important research and development for the right vaccines and treatments are. And without investments in clinical trials, the solutions found in the labs cannot find their way to the population and to patients. As a Deloitte study shows, Belgium is still in the top 3 countries in Europe in terms of authorized clinical trials per capita. The vast majority, around 80%, is sponsored by industry. But the industry is not the sole actor, on the contrary. The strong ecosystem in Belgium, with the expertise at the regulator, in particular the Federal Agency for Medicines, and the quality of hospital institutions and investigators is critical for success. Belgium has shown flexibility and has adapted its environment in emergencies, such as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown. For patients, this is all good news. They can have early access to promising treatments. The most important death causes in our country are cardiovascular diseases and cancer. Cancer is still growing as a major cause of premature death, despite all efforts. It does not surprise that clinical trial investigations in cancer represent the biggest share and that they are still growing in importance. Pharma.be is happy to see that the Belgian government has announced this autumn a long-term strategy for the biopharmaceutical industry in Belgium, and one of the work streams in the R&D bioplatform is related to clinical trials. The Minister of Health, Van den Broeke, clearly wants to focus on digitalization, and this is an ambition we can only applaud. Better access and higher quality of clinical data is key to the success of our excellent position. It will benefit the quality of further research and hence benefit the patients. So, to begin this roundtable, I would like to thank you all for your expertise, your contributions, and your interest in clinical trials. The ecosystem you are part of is one of the essential building blocks for future success. And this is what we need to make the New Year wish for a good health a reality. I now gladly give the floor to my colleagues, Christel and Nathalie, who will lead you through the program. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, Caroline, for your welcoming and introduction of this roundtable. We are happy to see you so numerous at this roundtable. More than 180 people subscribed for this session. And what is even more interesting is that all stakeholders are represented. Hospitals, patient organizations, authorities like the Medicines Agency and the College for Clinical Trials, CROs, policymakers, and of course, our partners and member companies. Today's program consists of 4 parts. The first presentations will set the scene. What is the footprint of clinical trials in Belgium? And what is happening at the level of the European and the Belgian Medicines Agency? Then we will deep dive in the topic of decentralized clinical trials. A decentralized trial is by definition a trial where the interaction with the patient is organized in a remote or a decentralized location, meaning away from the central research facility. Decentralized trials are increasingly using digital tools to interact with the patient. Digitalization and decentralization are therefore closely linked. We will hear the perspective of the industry, of the patient, and of the authorities regarding this topic. The third part of today's program is a short 10-minute debate where the speakers will answer some of your questions. We already received some questions on beforehand, but do not hesitate to post additional questions in the Q&A section. If there is time, we can add these to the debate. And then we will end the roundtable with conclusions and closing remarks. Please note that the slides will be shared with the participants after the session and that the session will also be recorded. So let's get started. My colleague Nathalie Lambeau, Clinical Trials Advisor at pharma.be, will kick off this roundtable by presenting the key results of a study in which we try to get a picture of how Belgium is performing as a clinical trial location, and this compared to a specific group of European countries. It is the 5th edition of this report. The first report was published in 2017, and all 5 reports were made in close collaboration with Deloitte. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Nathalie for her unbridled enthusiasm and great expertise. She is truly our clinical trials champion and the driving force behind this roundtable. The floor is yours, Nathalie.
Thank you very much, Christelle, and good afternoon, everyone. So we are very pleased to present you the result for 2020 of this Deloitte study about the footprint of clinical trials in Belgium. So on the next slide, you see the methodology of the study. Actually, the objective of the study is double. First is to provide key statistics about clinical trials in Belgium. But second, it is also to check how Belgium is performing in terms of conducting clinical trials as compared to a cohort of selected European countries. How are these countries selected? You have countries that are known for performing a lot of clinical trial, conducting a lot of clinical trial, but also countries which are perceived as having a potential for growth in terms of conducting clinical trials. In this selection, you will find our neighbors, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, Eastern countries such as Poland and Estonia, Northern countries such as Denmark and Sweden, Southern countries with Spain and UK. On the next slide, you see that when looking at the evolution of the number of clinical trials authorized per capita in this selection of European countries, we see that Belgium confirmed its position in the top 3 over the years and maintained a relatively stable number of authorized clinical trials. In this top 3, you also consistently find Denmark and Estonia. On the next slide, you can see that a strong footprint for a phase 1 trial is observed in Belgium. 1/4 of the authorized clinical trials in 2020 have been phase 1 trials. And we see that this proportion is higher than the proportion observed in the European countries. And this is also an observation that you can do over the years since 2016. It should also be noted that specifically in 2020, in Belgium, phase 1 trials in healthy volunteers have been maintained during the COVID-19 pandemic, while it hasn't been the case in all European countries. On the next slide, looking at it a bit more into detail in the phase 1 trial, we see that the phase 1 and the first in-human trial, so the trial in which the medicine is tested for the very first time in human, that both have been increasing in a proportion at a faster pace as compared to the overall number of authorized clinical trials. So how could we explain this particular footprint of early phase? This is first the expertise of the competent authorities in Belgium, competent authorities which have developed a dedicated domain of excellence in early phase. Second, the expertise of the clinical site with a relatively high number of dedicated phase 1 units in our countries. And third, a specific regulatory environment in Belgium with fast approval timelines for phase 1 trials. And this is a characteristic that will be maintained within the coming clinical trial regulation, Belgium maintaining so its fast approval timelines for phase 1 study in case of mononational phase 1 study in the clinical trial regulation. In the next slide, we see that we continue to observe that a wide variety of therapeutic areas is covered in Belgium with a growing expertise in cancer research over the past 5 years. In 2020, 35% of the authorized clinical trials have been trials in cancer. And if you look at the right side, this proportion of cancer trial has grown by 5% since 2016. Here, we should also note that for this so special year of 2020, clinical research in oncology has always continued in Belgium during the COVID-19 pandemic, while other therapeutic areas have been more impacted. I'm thinking about the cardiovascular disease, where surgical operations have been delayed, for instance. On the next slide, we also observe that we continue to see, despite its limited population size, that more than 1 out of 5 clinical trials authorized is conducted in the domain of rare disease in Belgium. And this proportion is confirmed and even slightly increasing since 2016. This could be explained by the expertise present in Belgium, and more specifically by the presence of key opinion leaders in the domain of rare disease in Belgium. And on the next slide, in addition, we can see that the upward trends in pediatric trials that we have observed in the previous edition of this Deloitte study since 2016 is confirmed in 2020. And we see on the right side that there has been a continuous increase in the number of pediatric trials in Belgium since 2016. And you will also see in the next slide that 15% of the study, pediatric study conducted in Europe are conducted in Belgium. Here you can observe that the vast majority of conducted and authorized trials in Belgium are commercial trials. We have a proportion of 80% of commercial trials in Belgium, a proportion which is higher than the one that could be observed in the European cohort as comparison. Now, on the next slide, if we look more a little bit at Belgium within Europe, we can see that a high percentage of clinical trials in Europe is conducted in Belgium, despite the fact that the population in Belgium represents only 2.6% of the total European population. For instance, 19% of the trials in cancer conducted in Europe are conducted in Belgium. And this is 17% and 13% when we are looking at trials in the immune system disease or in the nervous system disease. And as I have mentioned, 15% of the pediatric trials in Europe are conducted in Belgium. Now, in the next slide and in the last part of the study, we have looked at the key drivers to select Belgium as a clinical trial location. What makes a sponsor to choose Belgium to conduct a clinical trials? And this exercise has been done based on a survey conducted in the pharma.be members having clinical trials in Belgium. And we see here that in 2020, and this is confirming the previous results in 2017 and 2018 and 2019, this is really the expertise of the regulatory authorities offering scientific advice, help to define the protocol in clinical study, as well as the existing expertise of the investigators and the quality of the research center that are the dominating key drivers to select Belgium for conducting clinical trials. On the other hand, elements such as the patient recruitment efficiency, the adoption of new technology, the existence of standardized cost or the education of the population about clinical trial are still lagging behind. And now to finish the presentation of the result, on the next slide, we have for the year 2020, a particular year with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have more specifically looked at how Belgium has been ratings in terms of flexibility in case of emergency, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. This has also been done based on a survey in the pharma.be member. And what has been looked at is the overall flexibility of Belgium compared to other European countries, the time needed by the regulators to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic, or the time needed by the hospitals to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you see here that Belgium has been perceived to be able to be flexible as compared to the other European countries, and to be able to relatively quickly adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic, with nevertheless some room for improvement. An example that has been given is that the remote source document verification to control, to check remotely the source data in a study has been made possible in some European countries when the access to the hospital was restricted via ad hoc regulatory framework that have been put in place, while it wasn't already been possible in Belgium. So this was here in a nutshell, the result of this edition 2020 of the footprint of clinical trials in Belgium.
Thank you, Nathalie. The second speaker to set the scene is Mrs. Greet Musch, Director General for the DG Pre-Authorization at the Belgian Medicines Agency. Mrs. Musch is an industrial pharmacist and obtained a PhD in pharmaceutical and biomedical sciences. She started her career in the pharmaceutical industry, where she worked on the development of new medicines. At the agency, she overlooks activities related to unmet medical need, early access, and clinical research in a broad sense. She is also very involved in activities of the European authorities, such as the European Medicines Agency and the European Commission. That is why we invited her to give an overview of the ongoing activities related to clinical trials at the Belgian and the EU level. Mrs. Musch, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christel, and warm welcome to everyone in the audience. We have prepared the presentation to oversee together the clinical trials environment, which is changing a lot. You know, we are a few days before the start of the CTR go live finally, so it's a momentum where we see a lot of evolutions, and so I'm happy to share with you the main trends in Europe and also the consequences for our country. Can I have the next slide? So yeah, initiatives at European level. There is a new initiative, I think perhaps you heard already of it. It's the ACT EU. On the other hand, we have a lot changes in mandates from the clinical trial coordination group. So the previous clinical trial facilitation group will get a stronger mandate and with stronger objectives. So this will be the CTCG, where every national competent authority will be represented. We have the clinical trial advisory group, where the national contact points of the member states are represented at the Commission. And we have the clinical trial expert group, which is active at the Commission as well, where colleagues from the ethics committee, so in our case, the College, and the agencies or the represented there. We have a very huge implementing act related to safety, which has been published early January and which will enter in real life the 31st of January, so together with the clinical trial regulation. We will have also the initiative of the European Commission by controlling the member states to see whether all of them are implementing the CTR correctly. And Belgium also joined 2 initiatives, the European for Health Joint Action. So as has been said in the introduction by Mrs. Ven, we need our therapeutics and our vaccines as soon as possible. And that's why the European Commission launched the City Cure. So this means that trials with COVID-19 therapeutics will be assessed in a really expedited time frame, and Belgium will is taken the coordinatorship of this joint action. A second one is the safety, which is coordinated by Croatia, but where Belgium will take the lead of one of the work packages. If we go to the next slide, why is this initiative taken by the Commission? In fact, it's co-led by Commission, the heads of the Medicines Agency and the European Medicines Agency. So you see there is really a strong collaboration between those 3 organizations. What they see is that indeed the submission of multi-state trial applications is complex and burdensome, and they see it in the reduction of the results of trials which generate market authorizations, and that's a fact which has been seen especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. In contrast, because it's a pity, because Europe has a long history and a strong academic base, so we are really wanting to foster this innovation. We will have a momentum, as I said, by the clinical trial regulations going live with the CTIS system, so it's an opportunity to take, and as well the European Medicines Regulatory Network strategy as the pharmaceutical strategy from the Commission have it in their top priorities to foster innovation through clinical trials. Next slide. So what are the objectives? They want to optimize the European environment for clinical research, but of course with maintaining the high-level participant safety protection and data robustness and transparency. So they want to strengthen the leadership and coordination of the clinical trial authorizations and executions, also the ethical oversight, and see how the integration of ethics committees into clinical trials, but the whole regulatory life cycle can be optimized, supporting the conduct of large multinational clinical trials with a broader geographical footprint, to say, and reduce the administrative burden and increase the efficiency. And that's really a top priority now that the CTS will go live. It's really to work on optimizing the work processes for the clinical trial authorization. And as I said, strengthen the trials, especially delivering decisional evidence for not only for COVID-19 therapeutics, but wider, so for unmet medical needs, rare diseases, and so on, ensuring the support of academics and small, medium enterprises. We want to have an excellent and coordinated scientific advice, and that's really important if we want to speed up clinical trial authorizations and support marketing authorization, finally giving access to our patients. We should work on patient-oriented medicines development across all the populations, ensure a clear and unified European position on trials in strategic matters at the international level, and build further capacity in collaboration with the academia. Next slide. So what are, as I said, the Clinical Trial Coordination Group is a new group with a new mandate, with 9 defined priorities and objectives to fulfill. So first is the harmonization and coordination to support the full implementation of the regulation. We will work on an observatory for clinical trials, one on progresses, processes and results, but also on risk mitigation, evolution of trials as horizon scan. The safety surveillance, I will come back to that later with the Safety Act. Shared scientific assessment experience of clinical trial applications. We will work a lot on training. We will, of course, be key players in development of CETIS and vigilance IT systems. Cooperation with other relevant groups as well at the level of EMA, HMA as the Commission. And that's an important move in the good direction, that we really will work closer together with other existing groups, and we will work also on communication. Next slide. So this means, of course, that the current work of the CTFG continues during the transition period. So you can see it here. We will continue, of course, to work in the new IT system, CETIS. We will track the MS preparedness. We will further work on best practice guide and training, and the projects which are listed here, amongst other the decentralized trials, but also innovative complex trial designs, in vitro diagnostics, the interface with that, the safety and the registries. That is work which still will continue. Next slide. So that's what I said. So the CTAG is a new group which will start at the same date as the clinical trial regulation will go live. So in fact, it's a supervision of the regulation, and there are national contact points are represented, and the CTAG will continue to harmonize positions and publications of guidances, recommendations, Q&As, etc. So NCAs and colleagues from the ethics committees. Yeah, next slide. So we are working hard now to prepare to go live in a few days. So the colleagues are really active in giving training, sharing experience, and optimize the system using the new clinical trial information system. We will have to really work hard on optimizing the work process for authorization of trials, optimizing the current best practice guide. We will have to work also on optimizing and implementing the transition trials. Also see where can we put Belgium in the selection of reference member states and prepare for the union controls. Next slide. Implementing Act on Safety. So that's a new fact. It's work which has been done during the last year, but we will go live in a few days as well. And what is the objective of the safety cooperation is in fact to improve the protection of participants and patients, to improve also the data robustness regarding the safety profile of the investigational medicinal product and the active substance, and to have, of course, an increased efficiency through work sharing and taking account of the best existing expertise, and improve also the safety data finally for the marketing authorization applications. Next slide. What's the scope of this new implementing act? It's focused on the cooperation in assessment, especially on the SUSAR, so on the suspected unexpected serious adverse reaction, and also developing a best practice guide, which is nearly finished and ready before we go live. Next slide. So what are the new concepts and principles? It's the fact that we will introduce a new principle. It's the safety member state, and it's in fact the member state that will assess the information submitted as SUSAR and as annual safety report for clinical trials involving all IMPs with the same active substance. So it will member states will be selected on that and on a fair work share or on the existing expertise with the given active substance. Next slide. And then I will say a few words on the CTCure initiative. Next slide.
I wanted to add that we have 5 minutes left approximately.
Yeah. Thanks, I will speed up. So the objective is, of course, there is an urgent need that we are even at the 5th wave for the moment. We need robust trials, that's for sure, of evidence for authorization, especially. And we focus on providing harmonized and accelerated assessment of COVID-19 therapeutics. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. So the scope is only multinational trials, which will use novel COVID-19 therapeutics. So whether it's IMP without a marketing authorization or an IMP with a marketing authorization with a different indication or in a novel population. And as I said, we will use expedited timelines for the assessment of those trials. Next slide. So we developed an initial best practice guide. There is a work process which will be optimized by the member states and the sponsors at a regular basis. We strongly recommend sponsors to seek previous scientific advice and also to provide at least 2 weeks on forehand the planning so that we can organize ourselves in the best way. Next slide. We have submitted the proposal and now we are preparing for having the signatures of the grant. Next slide. And as I said, there will be the joint action will start the 1st of February. We are waiting the first applications mid-February and there will be an information session for stakeholders the 3rd February. Voila. Next slide. What are we doing at national level? So it's a bit, of course, the mirroring of what's happening at European side. So still working further on the readiness in our country. So working a lot on optimizing the best practice guides, on validation, on assessment, on conditions, and so on. CITES, so the information system really needs training and we will also try to work together with sponsors and to mimic some applications. And here you see the work related to the different steps which have to be developed in the project of preparing for the implementing act on safety. Next slide. So on top of that, you see the projects where we are really progressing. So one has to do with the complex clinical trial designs. We had a workshop on that in October last year, and Belgium participated very actively on that. Also a huge work on decentralized trials. The EU for Health projects, and as already mentioned by Caroline this morning, also the bioplatform where a specific working group is dedicated to clinical trials. So that's the end, I think, of my presentation. So thanks a lot.
So thank you very much, Greet, for this presentation and this complete overview of all the activities, a lot of activities now ongoing in Europe, but also in Belgium. Now we will really deep dive into the digitalization in clinical trials, illustrated with the example of decentralized trials. So Belgium being committed to keep itself on the map as one of the preferred location for conducting clinical trials has to be innovative and proactive. And so therefore, the way to digitalization in clinical trials should be paved to keep the pace with the evolution of the technology, but also of the society. Digitalization in the conduct of the clinical trials, digitalization in the collaboration between the sponsors and the clinical side, digitalization that can also catalyze the setup of the decentralized clinical trials. But for all this, there is a need for a common understanding of the needs, a shared interpretation of the new technology, and ad hoc framework guidelines to allow the use of those technology. We will now hear and confront the point of view of the pharma industry with Kirsten van der Waal and Bert Hartog from Janssen Pharmaceutica, the point of view of the patient with Michel Silva from Expertenpanel, and the point of view of the regulatory authorities with Mrs. Mush from the Federal Agency of Medicine. But let's start with the point of view of the industry. And I'm pleased to first introduce Kirsten van der Waal, Director in Belgium and in the Netherlands for the Global Clinical Operation at Janssen. And she has started this role at the beginning of the pandemic of the COVID-19. And Bert Hartog, Senior Director, Clinical Innovation at Janssen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you for allowing us to share our view and our experience. And thank you, pharma.be, for bringing together such a diverse and exquisite audience. We would like to talk to you about some of our experiences in the world of decentralized clinical trials and in the world of digital transformation of clinical trials. When we go to the next slide, we have a description of decentralizing clinical trials, where really our vision is to make trials more accessible and more convenient for patients, for participants in general, for investigators and their site staff. We want more people to be able to access more trials. We want to see the burden on patients reduced, the burden that comes from finding trials, participating in trials. And we want to see the burden on sites reduced, the burden that often comes with the administration of trials. At the end of the day, when we're successful, we should be able to see clinical trials integrated into the everyday living of a trial participant. Let's go to the next slide to zoom in a little bit more on the specter and the variation of decentralized trials. Because decentralized trials are not binary. There is a specter. On the left, you see a fully decentralized trial. On the right, you see a fully centralized trial, the more traditional way of working. Fully centralized, everything is done at the research site, like all trials used to be in years past. On the left-hand side, a fully decentralized setup where everything is conducted outside the brick and mortar study site. In reality, you see many study setups somewhere on this spectrum, a little bit more to the left, a little bit more to the right. And that's the way we think about it, where every clinical trial, we look at to see which elements of this trial for which participant can be done different than at the traditional study site. And that helps tailor trials to the individual patient or the individual patient population's need and optimize access and convenience that comes with participating in the trial. Let's go into the detail and some of the specifics. Kirsten, can you take it from here?
Sure, Bert, thank you. and zooming in a little bit on our experience, no words needed to say that the COVID pandemic pushed us to think differently about clinical trials, where we were already thinking on more digitalization, more decentralization of clinical trials. COVID really gave us that momentum where we were forced to reflect how we could make sure that our patients were treated in our trials, that our trials continue to run throughout that pandemic. And we have seen, of course, some changes depending on the different therapeutic areas that we have worked in. But zooming in on a couple of items where we definitely gained more experience throughout that pandemic. And I think we really should use that momentum now to build on our experiences, to build on, on the knowledge gained and continue in this direction where we could see how we could fit in those trials better in the lives of those patients. Experiences that we gained, of course, is one of the things that we have done throughout the pandemic is making sure that our patients continue to have access to the treatment by bringing the medication to the patient's home. So we set up a service where treatments were delivered in an ambient or temperature controlled way. And of course, it was medication for self-administration. But that was one of the ways to assure that patients continue to have treatment throughout the pandemic. And I think it's definitely a service we can continue to reflect on, depending on the specific trials, on the needs. Of course, digital health gained also a lot of attention because access to sites was closed in some cases. So we needed to see how we could interact with patients in a different way, approach them in a different way. And of course, virtual consultations and telemedicines gained momentum. And we really think that that is an opportunity also for the future, probably in a mixed model where some visits can be done via telemedicine, while others have definitely an added value to continue on site. Also, we used more and more e-consents, and I think the Belgian authorities have created a guidance paper in 2020 where they say, how do we go about these e-signatures? What are the requirements for signatures? For instance, that the discussion should be held during a video consult, but that also advanced qualified e-signatures like eID signature or It's Me signatures should be used. So clarification came here on this front, which was definitely helpful for sponsors and for sites to understand better on how do we use this. And it's clear that for some patients, it's an option, for others, maybe not. We gained also more and more experience with electronic clinical outcome assessments, where in the past, maybe a questionnaire was in an app or in a mobile app or application, while now we did more and more. We build in those clinical outcome assessments in a digital health platform, where we, in some trials, even enhanced it with a virtual study coordinator that helped patients to remind what they had to do, what was missing, reminders about treatments that were given, for instance. So definitely also more enhancements there. And we learned also with a virtual study coordinator that is an extension of the site staff. Also there are some things to learn, of course. Home healthcare is also a service that we installed throughout the pandemic, and which definitely shows benefits for some populations, for some trials. Those people that are providing those home healthcare services and really going to the patients' homes to treat them, to do certain assessments, blood draw, help with drug accountability, give patients training and education, or administer IP, those assessments could all be done, but it's also a matter of learning and making sure that we target populations very well that could benefit of this service. And then, of course, there are some enhanced data capabilities that we looked into. Let's reflect on remote monitoring, where Belgium had limited possibilities throughout the COVID pandemic, and where I think that other countries have really stepped up the game and said, okay, we will create a legislative framework around that to make it possible. Definitely something that we can think about. But we can also think in enhancement of our electronic health records. If they are more standardized, more searchable in the future, we can even now pilot electronic health records to sponsor directly, that we can step away in the future, hopefully, from the transcription of data into an eCRF. So more to come there, and definitely clear that there are some benefits linked to to the capabilities that we have all piloted and installed and that got momentum throughout the pandemic. You can go to the next slide, Julie. Of course, new things, new experiences all come with barriers and challenges. It is clear that for some patients, they maybe don't have yet access to bring your own device or an own internet access at their homes, or really an advanced phone that they can use. But also, if they're contacted by a virtual study coordinator, this is something that we really have to explain them well, so that there is an increased level of trust in those services. Also for sites, this is a completely new way of working. Some have organized their own home health services, while others work with services provided by sponsors. But how, as a PI, do you keep oversight? There is a risk of losing control of the site staff. Also in terms of legislation and the regulatory framework to test those innovative ways of doing clinical trials. If we think on GDPR, cybersecurity, there is definitely room to be more advanced in our regulatory framework, have clarity or guiding principles so that Belgium can remain an innovation hub. And I think there is really a challenge in front of us. Also in terms of industry, it has been learning by doing and being creative. So we are also still figuring out the right operating models for which trials. Does this really have an added value for which patients? Because it all comes with a cost, but definitely it has also the potential to enhance, for instance, electronic health record quality, but also the timeliness of data. But we definitely have there a lot of potential for the future, but then of course a lot needs to happen. You can go to the next slide, Julie. If I think, where do we need to, because now we had an experience, a good one, let's say, because we were forced to think out of the box and therefore we jumped into the deep. Where can we as a country evolve even more? I already touched upon it, but having clear data standards, increased electronic health records, capabilities and standardization can really help us to have searchable data that can interact with each other and potentially also with networks. We can work on a legal framework to support really the pioneering role of Belgium. If we think on remote monitoring, but also GDPR and the clinical trial regulation, we know that it's still a gray zone where sometimes it's difficult to operate. And we know that we are still working with regional and federal regulations. So maybe also there is an opportunity to align. There is definitely also an opportunity for increased collaboration between university hospitals and the peripheral centers and potentially GPs, so that we can really not only work to attract more trials to Belgium, but also to have trials with more patients in there. And of course, we think with the patients evolving, education of the general public on clinical trials, on the one hand, and see it as an option for treatment, but on the other hand, we should also be aware that patients should be able to find trials, and physicians as well. So a really searchable clinical trial database can really help to increase the voice of the patient. And one thing which we scored not really well on, if we looked at Nathalie's presentation, was the contracting, the costs. So working with mandatory clinical trial templates, but also cost structures could definitely help to increase the competitive status of Belgium in clinical trials. And then I pass on to Bert again, I think.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you for these insights from experiences on the ground in Belgium with trials that we were running from before COVID or even started during COVID. So all extremely relevant. At the beginning, it was mentioned, my job is in clinical innovation. And that's where we look for what's on the horizon. Which boundaries can we push out just a bit further? How can we transform the way clinical trials can be done? And specific to the audience today, I would like to share with you a new way of thinking about clinical research, and that is clinical research as a care option. We've talked about how can we integrate clinical trials in everyday living. This is the next level. This is how can we integrate clinical research in the patient journey, in care selection. How can we get the dialogue on participation in a clinical trial happen at the same time as more routine treatment options are being discussed? What you see here is an event last year in US where this topic was the sole topic for an entire conference. You see citation from Dr. Janet Woodcock, formerly with FDA, talking about how can we make clinical research more accessible by making it part of routine care delivery. If you go to the next slide, a little bit of interpretation. What would this mean in daily life? Well, what it would mean is integration of clinical research options in the dialogue between healthcare provider and patient or caregiver or both, discussing when explaining treatment options that clinical research may be one such option that may be available to the specific patient. What it would require, Kirsten already mentioned this, it needs very, very accurate insights into available clinical trials. What trials are open, actively recruiting? What are the eligibility criteria? So when it's being discussed, there needs to be a reasonable chance of being able to participate. The trial design may need to be adapted to allow for remote screening or even remote participation. It's not a given that everybody can travel to every research site. So it may require a decentralized trial design for this type of trial screening. And then the roles and responsibilities between investigator, treating physician, and patient need to be crystal clear. How about administration? What information is going to be recorded where? What about financial implications when an investigator takes responsibility for the trial side of treatment, where a treating physician may continue the routine treatment? How do we deal with that? How do we avoid the perception or the reality of income loss when a treating physician is not the same as an investigator? But then really the question should be, particularly for this audience, why not? Why would we not make clinical research a care option? How can we make this something that is a little bit more at the forefront and a little bit more a fallback option? Just a thought to share with the audience. In closing, last slide, let me bring some of this together. We've shown DCTs offer benefits, hopefully no surprises there, but we've also shown it can be done. Yes, it needs to be refined. Yes, there's things to learn to further optimize, but it can be done. With DCTs, along the spectrum of decentralization, more trials can be attracted to the country, more trials can recruit more patients, making it very attractive for sponsors to launch trials in Belgium. It does require collaboration between healthcare providers, legislators, and sponsors. Different collaboration than we see today, more, but also novel collaboration, talking about how can we adapt the legal framework for the requirements that come with these decentralized trials. How can we position Belgium as an innovation hub also in this era? Not look back only and see what worked well, but look ahead and see how can we continue to position ourselves as an innovation hub for the industry, for the larger ecosystem. Attracting more trials, attracting more participants, I mentioned, there's a real opportunity to be proactive here. And then this clinical research as a care option may be an interesting alternative for some patients to change away from only the dialogue on standard care options into one that includes research options. So let me close there and hand back to Nathalie.
Thanks a lot, Bert and Kirsten, for your ambitious and inspiring messages coming from the sponsors. Now I am very pleased to present Mitchell Silva to explain the perspective of the patient regarding decentralized clinical trials and the use of digital tools in trials. Mitchell is a patient entrepreneur and the founder of Expertenpanel. His mission in life is to develop solutions to empower patients. He obtained a PhD in bioengineering and is co-author of various scientific publications related to patient engagement. Mitchell is also one of the drivers behind Yopati Belgium and also behind the Patient Expert Center, two organizations that are providing support to educate patient experts. His expertise in understanding patients' needs is not only based on his professional background, but also on his experience as a patient in searching for and participating in clinical trials. Hello, Mitchell. Welcome to this roundtable.
Hello, Crystal. Thank you for inviting patients around the table. It's really great to see that patients are finally seen as actually real partners in drug development.
Thank you, Mitchell. And the fact that several patient organizations are also joining us today is also a sign that they are really interested in clinical trials. And it's also a message that we get from them more and more. And that's perhaps also one of my first questions to you is that we heard that digitalization in clinical trials can be a catalyzer for decentralized clinical trials. So which would imply that trials would increasingly be conducted remotely or in the home of participants. From a patient point of view, which would be the benefits and advantages, but perhaps also the challenges or even disadvantages for patients?
Yeah, indeed. I think when you look to digitization, it's absolutely the way ahead. I think all patients are really, especially now with the COVID pandemic, are confronted with technology and they see the benefits. And I think a lot of the points were also mentioned by Kirsten and Bert as well. When we ask patients, okay, what do you prefer when you are entering data to report your health outcomes? Most patients definitely say, okay, digital instead of paper, and if possible, integrated on my mobile phone in an app instead of having a different device. Some patients say even further, okay, let's include features for bidirectional communication. In a trial setting, this might be sometimes difficult, of course, because you have to monitor everything that is said. But I think even a bigger advantage of decentralized clinical trials is the convenience. I don't know how many of you have participated in a trial, but often the visits are shorter than the transport time to go to the sites. This often is really not taking into account when we think about the patient burden of clinical trials. In Belgium, we're lucky that we're a small country, but okay, imagine in the US and in other countries, it's a completely different story. And I think also what is interesting is that when you look to certain patients, you will see higher motivation, higher engagement, because they feel maybe more in control with the necessary apps and tools you provide, which could increase the data quality as well. So this is interesting because at the end, you also take away the confrontation of the patient with their disease by actually always being present in the hospital to a home setting where they feel more relaxed and more on their ease. Now, of course, there are some attention points, and I think attention points, I think one interesting thing was the virtual trial coordinator that Kirsten mentioned. I think when we listen to patients, some patients really like the face-to-face contact, and it's really important to not forget that. And for some patients, it's a motivation, and they can ask questions, they feel more supported. Some patients will miss this contact and they become a bit more negligent. So they might lose interest, might be less daring to their data they have to enter. And that's why I think it's important to see, okay, in what way can you also take into account the preferences of the patients. So first of all, when support is needed, what type of support? Is it pure, an avatar, or is it a human that is in support? But also in terms of reminders, etc. Some patients will need it and will love it, others will hate it, and you will create frustration. So it's really important to really understand your target population information. And this might vary, of course, if you are, for example, a patient with Parkinson versus an asthma patient, you have completely different requirements in terms of user experience as well. So all of this should be studied and taken into account.
Thank you, Michel. Now, from your point of view, how can we ensure a smooth pathway for the digitalization of clinical trials, from the development of the trial to the onboarding of patients? Do you see a role there for patients as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think, and it's also clear more and more in research projects, and I think some industry players are really setting the tone here by really incorporating the patient voice early. So when trials are being designed, I think more and more we see the benefit of that. So patients, of course, but also the researchers. So it's really not only seeing, okay, what type of prems and proms are relevant to the patient, but also how do you translate that to a system that is easy for them to use in their daily lives. And of course, this will vary per therapeutic area and the complexities of the interventions, etc. But I think what is important or not to just take into account is or think about what are the ways you can actually embed patient engagement in the different processes as the industry. So you can do this with advisory boards, but now in Belgium there's a nice example of the PEC, so the Patient Expert Center, where you actually have some patient experts where you can actually talk to. And the benefit is that they understand the complexity of the trials. So you can have efficient discussions with them. And this is interesting in your design phase. And then once you would like to test it on a more broader public, you go to the lay patients. So it's kind of a two-step model, actually. So this is something that can really, I think, smoothen out the way. And also once patients are accepted in the trial, like a bit related to the virtual assistant and avatar, make sure that you have all the supportive modules that are necessary. And this means that you should listen to your target audience to define these modules. So to really see what are the needs and how do you translate this in something that is easy to understand, because often now we come with a lot of information, and that's why it's good to actually run all of this via the patients to optimize it so it's easy, it's of course credible, etc., but also understandable and in local language, which is obvious, I think, for the trials. But also, I think after or during the trial, we see more and more from patients a big motivation for them and participating in trials is they will get to know their body better somehow. You have all the tools available now to capture this data, and patients actually would like to see the evolution of whatever they enter and their health status. Some researchers might say, okay, but it's not good that patients see their evolution because it might maybe alter behavior. But it's worthwhile thinking about these types of features at the moment that you're designing your digital tools to capture all of this information, and also after the trial. So once the trial is over, there's a nice example of trialsummaries.com, so an organization that actually notifies patients about trial results for trials they participated in. And this is actually something that we hear often from patients, that they really want to be kept informed about what is happening, and this can actually maybe motivate them for participation in future trials if they are eligible.
Thank you. A lot of interesting answers. I have one final question for you, Mitch. We often hear patients say that they do not have enough information about ongoing clinical trials, that it's difficult for them to find this information. And if they find it, it's all in English and it's very complicated for laypersons. What is your vision on that? And could you tell us what information patients and patient organizations need and how we could deliver this information to them?
No, absolutely. This is something that came out, I think, both in the presentation from Bert and also the Deloitte study. And also me personally, I participated in several trials, and even as an educated person, I had hard times finding a trial. And so imagine someone that is completely not educated in this field. And what we see a real need is that patients want to have information in local language and understandable. And often we see nice initiatives coming up. And cancer, there's specific initiatives. There's, of course, a Fach engine where you can actually search for clinical trials. But the issue there is always, again, English. It's not understandable for a lot of patients. So what we're actually working on with Asperity is now to see how can we work closer with the patients' organizations to embed a search engine that provides search results in local language, understandable language, and where metadata could potentially be assessed, be added, small videos, etc. Now, of course, before going into this direction, we are actually doing a feasibility study to really understand what can we do, what can we add in terms of data, who should do this, what are the technical frameworks, ethical frameworks, regulatory frameworks related to this before we go to implementation.
Thank you. And I would like to take this opportunity to apologize for the fact that this roundtable is also in English, because we got a comment by a patient organization telling us that it's not accessible for them because everything is in English. So my apologies for that. We have a project with patient organizations, a separate project, not specifically dedicated to clinical trials, but there we do communicate in English, in Dutch and in French only to avoid this problem. So I now pass the word on to Nathalie for the next interview.
Yes, so I'm pleased now to welcome back Mrs. Kretmusch, so we can further discuss the perspective from the regulator for the decentralized trial, know how in practice to implement those decentralized clinical trials. So what are the main challenges from a regulator point of view to implement, to conduct those decentralized clinical trials according to you?
Yes, thanks for the question, Nathalie. Of course, we as an authority, and as an authority, I mean there are several players. We have the national competent authority, to say so, the agency, where we have also the fact of authorization, but also the fact of GCP, GMP inspector's view. And then we have the ethical point of view from colleagues from college and ethics. But in general, it's like Bert said, the most applications we receive are hybrid applications with some certain well-specified decentralized elements. And what we do as an authority is each time check the feasibility of the decentralized elements in that trial, and to assess their impact on the scientific validity, on the benefit risk, on the patient safety and well-being of the patient, and protecting the patient rights, including the data protection. GDPR is mentioned, we know it all, it's not an easy one to tackle. So that's one. And then we have some, how should I say, more additional points of attention, and in the applications we see, whether it's at European level or at national level, it's in fact the medical oversights need to be assured throughout the trial, and that's really an important one. As Mitch said, the proactive involvement of patients in the design and also check the feasibility is an important one. We had some applications where, for instance, the selection, the selection bias on the fact that you digitalize, in what sense does you have a bias then on your trial results? That's in so if you consult at the very early stage, as we do already at the agency via scientific advice, etc. But I think that's an important one, and the same idea could be to do the same with the investigator. In fact, we are working on a guidance at European and national level, where we in fact focus on the recruitment, the patient information, the e-consent. How can we really work on that? Advertising, pre-trial screening, etc. Then if you look to the clinical operations, there we look, of course, what type of product do we have? Is it a new IMP? Is it an authorized one? What's the type of study? What's the type of population which is envisaged? As already said by previous ones, the impact to replace face-to-face meetings by virtual meetings, that's also a critical one. And the fact that an investigator needs still to oversee all the examinations, and that's really an important one too. What we also would like to suggest is that if you make such an application, is that we should have in the protocol a clear just tick box, in fact, of the digital elements you use, the justification why you use it, and then also provide the kind of how you see the data flow, how you see the communication flow throughout the trial. That's really worthwhile to have that in such a way. We have the safety, which is also a critical part, of course. It still remains a medical activity. We should be sure that the IT tools used are really reliable and really collect correctly the data. So the validity and the security of the IT tools. And the adverse events reported via those digital platforms. So there, I think we should think on lines to take for as well the investigators as the participants. That's the idea. And then all of course, the chapter on data generation, processing, and quality. That is a huge one, and there is a lot of activities at regulatory side. So there it's the availability, but also the integrity, the reliability, and the quality and robustness of the data, which is important for us. So these are a bit the big issues in general where authorities look at. But on the other hand, I can assure that authorities are also convinced of the benefit of decentralized trials. So.
We have here that guidelines are important to be in place to facilitate the conduct of those decentralized trials. You just have mentioned that guidelines are now under discussion at European level. So could you please give us a little bit more information about the activities in terms of guidelines decentralized trials that are ongoing and how they can be leveraged also at the Belgium level?
Yeah, so that's why we work on two levels to say. So the first one is, in fact, that during COVID-19 it became clear that we should how should I say, harmonize as much as possible on giving some guidances. So what we did is we took an initiative more from NCA, but we saw very rapidly that we have to liaise with ethics committees, colleagues, as well as from GCP, GMP to really align. The process is a bit, how should I say, not that fast, because you have to consult with many actors. On the other hand, I think it will more, it will remain, and it will be more robust, in my view, to have a solid European recommendation paper. So we are working on that with colleagues from GCP, colleagues from ethics committees, and from the national competent authorities, and we hope to have a first draft ready, let's say March, April this year, so that we consult with the different stakeholders, one, and two, also to define a bit, or to redefine perhaps a bit the priorities. And then perhaps focus on specific domains to see which barriers are still to be optimized. That's one point. On the other hand, we think that, and we learn also that if sponsors come seeking advice in a very early stage, whether it's at national level or at central level, it helps us a lot, because you learn by discussing and doing so. So these are a bit the two levels we are working on for the moment.
So if we go and we look at the future, the very next step now, if I understand well, is this European guideline, and then in Belgium, the discussion with the stakeholders once the guidelines is available, to see how we can implement this further in our country. Is that what you see as next step? Or?
I should see that as next step, because it gives already a a really good sustainable basis to discuss with different players aligned. So that's an advantage in my view. Refocusing on priorities is an important one with different stakeholders, as well with patients, as with sponsors, as with investigators. Still providing scientific advice, because we learn a lot from that on practical cases. And there are a lot of initiatives also at national and at European level. And another possibility could be that we start with some pilots in a well-thinked way, I should say. That's also a possibility. Yeah.
So thank you very much for this perspective from the federal agency, and we have very concrete next step. So for the coming weeks and coming months, as I see at European and at Belgium level. So now I will leave the word to Christelle for the next part.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers for the insights they provided. And so it's time to proceed with the third part of today's program, the debate with Bert, Kirsten, Mitchell, and Greet. And the first question is for Mrs. Mush again. And this question comes from our member company. Specifically, it's more a rumor and a concern than it is a question. We know, Greet, that your mandate as DG pre-authorization is coming to its end. And there is some concern among our member companies if the agency will maintain its commitment to innovation and to clinical trials, because we've also always seen you as the face at the agency, or the person at the agency that's really committed to that mission. So just a small insight to reassure everybody around the table.
I don't know whether this is a compliment or a fact that
we
are growing older, but okay. No, it's true that my mandate, I will finish my mandate in a near future. But as you saw in the presentation, I think we are really engaged as well at European and national level to I found it a nice word from Bert, the clinical trials as care. I think it's a good idea, and I'm convinced that we have really great opportunities here in Belgium, and personally, yeah, I think we should continue in that way. So for myself, I will certainly continue in those projects.
Thank you. Thank you.
And work together, of course, with the new Director General and to make it, and the other colleagues, of course, to make it as good as possible. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We have a second question for the industry partners, but also for Mitch. And it's a question that was put by a physician who said, as decentralized and virtual trials are gaining momentum and thus increasing the number of in-person visits, lack of medication adherence could be a challenge. And how can sponsors address this? I will first perhaps the point of view of Bert or Kirsten.
Yeah, I can start, and Kirsten, maybe you have some hands-on experience where we've seen this development in real life. In general, I would be interested why the question comes up now, because typically medication adherence is monitored for self-administration, that is monitored by looking at the return medication, the leftover, and then assuming that what is not returned was used, and assuming that it was used as per protocol. That is a lot of assumptions that place a lot of trust on the relationship between investigator or trial coordinator, study nurse, and patient. I would think in a home setting where people feel more comfortable, feel perhaps a little bit less that somebody is looking over their shoulder, that may actually be conducive to adhere to treatment a little bit more. But more important, with the digitalization of trials, we have opportunities to actually monitor what happens. A sensor in a pill bottle that actually monitors when the bottle is opened and closed. to see if medication was taken out, but has proven to have a very good correlation with actual medication taken. Very simple solution that gives very good insight for discussing with the site based on patterns, where the pattern of medication taking may be a good discussion starter between care provider, investigator, and patient. So the digitization is probably more important than the remote or on-site visit. Kirsten, any specific example you can share?
Yeah, we have indeed tested already those blisters, which give us insights in the use of the medication, but definitely also we could use digitalization in terms of reminders to patients. A more remote follow-up or discussion with patients could be held. And I think we should always target those decentralized services that we are using, depending really on the patient population. We are also convinced that for certain patient populations, this truly has maybe less of a benefit, while for others, maybe still very active people, these services could be a true benefit. So I think we should really have that discussion. And as Mitchell also said, I think it's also important to propose those services to participants in our trials, and also have options for participants to offer certain services if patients agree to it, so that the trial can better fit into their lives and that we can make it work for every patient that participates in the trials.
Thank you, Kirsten. Mitchell, do you have something to add on top of that?
Yeah, I think, of course, it's great to have this technology, and I'm also convinced that some patients will see it as a motivator. But also, personally, I see myself as a highly engaged patient. And I remember when I was on the trial as well, I had to take maintenance medication. And it sounds very stupid, but sometimes even if you take your medication for years and years, it's good to be reminded why it's important to take every day your medication in the right way. Because somehow at certain moments it just, fades away. And the moment you say, okay, I didn't take my whatever today, okay, it's no problem. Tomorrow is the next day. And you have more and more of these days, less and less adherence, until there's a new moment where you get, this alert, okay, I really have to take this serious. Let's go again. So, and this is nice with the face-to-face visits. It's sometimes kind of a small wake-up call, like take your health serious. And that's why I think it's good to include this in, of course, the digital tools, but it might be good to think about, okay, how can we make sure that patients really take their maintenance medication besides the IMP? Because this should also be monitored in a very clear and objective way. And at the end, it's all about habit building as well. And maybe these apps offer a nice opportunity to introduce habits in a way. And this is a way where you can use personalized approaches maybe that are tailored to the patient population. So I see there's opportunities, but also let's don't forget that patients sometimes tend to forget that they're patients as well.
Luckily, huh?
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you, Mitchell. And I have one final question, which came from a patient organization in the public. It's about rare diseases or clinical trials for rare diseases. Question is for Greet, if Europe is considering a kind of a fast track like the one that FDA has for rare or orphan diseases.
As far as I'm informed, I did not saw an initiative focused on that, but you can imagine if we launched the initiative for the COVID-19 therapeutics, for instance, to have an expedited assessment. This could also be a model for rare disease or unmet medical needs. And in my view, in my personal view, I think that's also the direction the European Commission would like to go, to really, okay, we have to implement now the CTR, we will have to learn and optimize the work process. We will start with the COVID-19 multinational therapeutics, but this could be a model also for other niche areas where we need fast development to use that way of working.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think the other hand is, okay, you can speed up authorization, but you should also, in my view, speed up the startup of your trials in Europe. And that's another fact which is perhaps less in the hands of the NCAs, but where, for instance, the European networks and so on could be used as well.
And of course, there's also the access side. Once that a drug has been approved by the Medicines Agency, but that's how to accelerate the access. That's another topic. But we certainly have a lot of great ideas on that. I would like to end the debate also looking at the time, and we thank all the participants, and thanks also to the audience for your questions. And so I would now like to give the floor to Edel Hendricks. Mrs. Hendricks has a master's degree in psychology. She has an enormous expertise in clinical trials, since she's also the clinical study unit country head in Belgium at Sanofi. And we invited her to close this roundtable because of her commitment within pharma.be, since she is the chair of our task force clinical trials within the association. Edel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Crystal. First of all, a big shout out to all our speakers, panelists, and also the moderators of today, because they've given us quite some food for thought, I think. Big changes are ongoing, big changes are coming, and we need to be ready. Digitalization is at the top of all our agendas, even more so since the pandemic. I've tried to summarize the topics brought to our attention today. So first of all, looking back at the previous year, we can find a wealth of information on how we are doing in the Belgium in relation to clinical trials. The results from the Deloitte report are very informative. And as take-home message, I would like to repeat 3 main points. Belgium remains in the top 3 European countries where we look at the number of authorized clinical trials per capita. And especially we have a very strong footprint in early phase, first in human phase 1 studies, and also a growing expertise in cancer research over the past 5 years. We have certain talents in Belgium. We have the key strengths is the expertise at the level of the federal agency, specialized and with a lot of attention for these phase 1 studies and first in human studies. But let us not forget the expertise of our clinical sites, the hospitals, institutions, and investigators in all the different domains, and the quality of the research centers that they provide. During the pandemic, Belgium has shown some good flexibility and adaptability to the environment, and we have made sure that we could tackle the COVID-19 pandemic in an adequate way. The environment is changing for clinical trials, and this is impacting the initiatives on European and Belgian level. Many initiatives have started and are being implemented. As you have heard from Geert Meurs, Belgium is taking the lead in many important projects, showing great vision and strategy for the future. It's great to hear that we try to be in the driving seat of many important projects that will impact the way we will conduct clinical trials in the future. I'm thinking about the CTR CITES implementation. We have been really involved in that, or the ACT EU accelerating of clinical trials, or all the other projects that we have taken on and try to be in the lead, or at least leading a working group. One thing that I've noted down for me, especially in this, is that at EU level, they are looking forward to support the development of inclusive patient-oriented trials. And I think that's what we all are looking for. From our colleagues from Janssen Pharmaceutica, Kirsten and Bert, we have heard some nice examples on how digital and clinical trials match up well to put the patient at the center of our clinical daily activities. Main goal is to have the clinical trials fit better to the patient's daily life and with less burden. Hybrid trials are already in our presence, but will be for sure our future way of doing clinical trials. We need to continue on this road and ensure that Belgium is ready with the necessary legal framework in place to implement even more and more easy digitalization in the trials. Enhancement of health record standardization would also be a good step to take. To make sure we can do these hybrid trials, there is still some work to do. We have to ensure that GDPR is followed, ensure that access of all patients to the digital tools are possible, and we need to educate all still stakeholders involved to make sure that everybody feels comfortable in using these new tools. One other thing they mentioned, can clinical trials become a valid care option? I think this is something we all need to think about indeed. Digital may be the way forward to allow easier access to patients to clinical trials and to include patients' needs. But incorporating the patient's voice in the design of the clinical trial is a new way of working that has been increasingly used by our sponsors, and as we heard, is much appreciated by our patients. Easier access has to be realized, and to having a tool that makes it easier for patients to find a clinical trial that fits his or her needs in local languages, or for sharing of results or other information would be a plus. I think the project that Mitchell da Silva and Asperity have started to see how this can be developed is a good way to go, and it will certainly facilitate access for patients to clinical trials. There are still some challenges and hurdles to take for the regulators as it comes to full decentralized trials, factors such as IMP, investigational product, type of study, study population, safety follow-up, medical oversight, and the quality safety, GDPR proving of the IT tools are key when evaluating the new way of working. There is some good news on the horizon. There is an EU regulation being developed, and once released, the next steps will be to see how we can implement this at the BE level in collaboration with the ethics committees and the inspection members, using the learnings from scientific advice and proposed priorities. Some exciting times to come. Digitalization in clinical trials is opening doors we did not have before. We will be able to bring clinical trials closer to the patient's home and reduce the burden that comes with participating in clinical trial. Including as much as possible digital tools in a hybrid approach will allow to avoid unnecessary hospital visits, but at the same time gaining on information collection while still having the connection with the doctor and other members of the medical team. It will allow to make clinical trials more inclusive. People that might not have taken part because of the high demands of a clinical trial might now consider with these hybrid trials to feel more able to participate. It will eliminate for a part the issue of distance and time investments, but it might also enhance patient engagement, as Mitchell told us. Digital tools may also allow more preferable hospitals to be more involved and with more access to clinical trials, making again access for patients to the trials again easier. Giving patients options to choose in what digital tools they think would be useful for them would also be a very good practice. It is important that we keep pushing this digitalization and innovation, as I truly believe it is the way forward, but still ensuring that patients still feel cared for. Just to end on a note, I'm very proud as a task force lead to be able to tell you that our pharma.be task force clinical trials does consider digitalization in all forms as a high priority. I'm thinking about e-consent, e-signature, apps, wearables, remote SDV, monitoring, direct-to-patient supplies, home healthcare, telemedicine, paperless trials. And we have worked already for the last 2 years on different aspects to prepare the landscape for this digitalization in clinical trials. And it is continued to be put high on our agenda also for this year. It's our priority within the task force to formulate all as clearly as possible our questions to the legislator and help them, for example, by preparing white papers to understand the needs there are and to ensure that Belgium does stay on top of the list for all conducting clinical trials.